Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. We're going to get started right on time today because we have six wonderful speakers to share with you. And the sooner we can get started, the better, so that you can get directly to our speakers. So we'll go to our slideshow. I will share my screen. Whoops, there we go. My name is Geraldine Lopez Mendoza. I'm the Los Angeles Regional Organizer for the Climate Center. This is the Climate Center's Envisioning a Climate Safe California webinar series. And today I wanted to share quickly our vision for the state. This is the Climate Center's vision. We believe in thriving, healthy communities. And I really want to emphasize that we want to make sure that everyone in California benefits from equitable access to climate solutions, from clean air to renewable energy, healthy food, and more. Today, our topic is investing in climate despite budget uncertainty. And we have two elected officials who will be joining us today. So we're really excited to get to their information. But before we go forward, I wanted to share some thoughts with you. California faces a significant deficit, prompting Governor Newsom to propose billions in budget cuts, including substantial reductions and delays to key climate programs that support cleaner air, public health and safety, and help ensure that state programs are implemented equitably, serving historically disadvantaged and pollution-burdened communities. A recent report released by Next 10 shows that California is not on track to meet its 2030 climate goals, projecting that we will be 17 years, I repeat, 17 years late in reaching that goal. This is clearly the wrong time to cut climate investments. Concurrently, the state continues to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to multinational oil and gas corporations. At the same time, these companies have been making record profits and polluting California's air and making climate worse. Budgets can be complex and seem abstract, but as my colleagues will make clear during today's webinar, cuts to critical clean air and climate programs have real and immediate human consequences, especially in low-income communities of color. Climate change does not cease being a crisis because the state has a deficit. Defunding programs that citizens of California are relying upon now creates havoc, uncertainty, and also has a negative impact on private investment that can magnify the impact of public dollars multiple times. What we need is to be clear-eyed about the true impacts of cuts, invest public resources as wisely as possible, and be creative in looking for new investments or shifting existing revenue streams. Give me a minute. Here is today's agenda. You'll see that it's jam-packed with a number of experts and elected officials who are prepared to share with you today their thoughts on a variety of different issues relating to the climate budget. So it's my pleasure now to introduce to you Amy Costa, who will be speaking on Budget 101. Amy, I hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Geraldine, so much for the introduction and grounding our conversation today. We have a jam-packed agenda, so I'm going to just go ahead and jump right in. Today I'll be presenting some general overview of the budget process in California that can help each of you understand kind of the major milestones and who the major players are. With that, can we go ahead and bring up my slides? Great. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we should care about the budget, the key budget players, and some budget basics. Next slide, please. Just briefly about me, my name is Amy Costa, and I previously served as the Chief Deputy Director of Budget at the Department of Finance. So I'm a self-professed budget nerd. Next up. This is what we'll go over briefly. Next slide, please. So I love this, and I think Geraldine did a really good job, and I think throughout the day, you're going to understand why you should care about the budget. Obviously, many of the programs that we care about specifically in climate do require funding investment. And so the budget is really, in many ways, how the policy that we work to get implemented is actually operationalized. And particularly in climate, there have been some pretty significant investments in recent years to help us reach the state's climate goals. Next slide. These are some of the key players. So, no surprises here. Obviously, the governor has a key role in proposing the budget, negotiating the budget, and getting it passed, as well as each house of the legislature, both the Senate and the Assembly. For the governor, much of this work is done at the Department of Finance. And additionally, the legislature is advised by the Legislative Analyst's Office. And each of these entities also provides wonderful resources for you as advocates to understand more the proposals and the implications that are part of the budget. Slide. This is just a quote from George Bush that I like. I think a lot of times people think a budget is just a bunch of numbers and maybe it's kind of boring. But as Geraldine so correctly pointed out, there are many real world implications regarding what we do and do not fund in the state budget. Next slide. So this is what we sometimes refer to as the budget architecture. And this gets a little bit wonky, but I do think it's really important to understand because it impacts every program in the budget. We have four main funding sources in the budget: the general fund, special funds, bond funds, and federal funds. You've heard about all of them in this year's budget conversations because those are kind of how we're paying for certain things. There are also constitutional provisions, and these are important because often these calculations occur before the state even spends any of the money or knows how much they have to spend. And these include the rainy day fund. Obviously, we've heard about that with the potential use of reserves this year. Proposition 98, which is the K through 14 educational guarantee. And then in recent years, the state appropriation limit, or the GAN limit, has come into effect. Prop 98 in particular, I point out because it roughly equates to 40% of the budget. And so it's important to know what's happening there for all the other programs in the general fund, because it really is the driving factor of what is remaining for other program expenditures. Next slide. We can go to the next slide, but I always like to do this one because I think sometimes folks don't necessarily know where do the dollars go and where are the major general fund appropriations. And you can see, as I referenced previously, in the state, a lot of it actually goes to education, and that is driven by Proposition 98, which creates a funding requirement for our K through 14 schools. Next slide. This is always an interesting one too. We can go to the next slide. And you hear this a lot. Personal income tax is one of the biggest expenditure sources that we have in the state. It is historically extremely volatile. And so that is why people often ask, why is California so feast or famine? In part, it's because we have a fairly progressive personal income tax, which relies heavily on our highest income earners. Next slide. Here's just a couple of facts about that, which is that it's an incredibly small group of Californians that are, high income earners that are responsible for a very large portion of our revenues. And that includes capital gains. So literally, we are following the stock market and all of the volatility that includes. And that's why in Prop 2, when we see these big spikes in capital gains, it actually increases the amount that we need to put into our reserves based on this historic trend in California. Next slide. This is kind of the roadmap for the budget. And I would just note here that we're getting ready to enter into the May revise, and then we go into the constitutional deadline for passage. I will note this is a very short period between May revise and budget adoption. And it's extremely truncated. And so I would just point out that in the next month, things are going to be really going at quite a quick pace. Next slide, please. This is a finance document that shows you, and you can find this on the Department of Finance website. This is when we had conference committee, which we have not had in recent years, but it is kind of a roadmap of in greater detail of the major kind of milestones in the budget cycle. Next slide, please. Those are just a couple of resources at the end, which I'm sure Climate Center will provide to you. If you want to find additional detail about the budget, I've provided some hyperlinks for you to research. With that, I'm happy to turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. That was a very quick and dirty explanation of the budget process, but one I think sets the table for the rest of our discussions. I want to thank you for your insights. So next we will move to Chris Chavez of the Coalition for Clean Air, who will be discussing investing in clean air and using transportation funds to support clean air and disadvantages. Chris.
Yes, thank you. As somebody who's never been particularly fond of math, my life certainly revolves around the budget these days. So thank you, everybody. My name is Chris Chavez. I am the Deputy Policy Director at Coalition for Clean Air. Coalition for Clean Air, we work to protect public health, improve air quality, and prevent climate change. So we know that climate change is actively happening. And really, a lot of our work focuses in the transportation sector. We work with other organizations in the Charge Ahead California campaign, and that includes NRDC, Greenlining, Environment California, and Communities for a Better Environment. And that also has sort of spread into what is known as the Invest in Clean Air campaign. We actually just had our Invest in Clean Air call right before this webinar. I know I shared a couple of slides with the hosts. Can we bring those up? Great, thank you. So again, our campaign is the Invest in Clean Air campaign as part of Charge Ahead California. You want to scroll down a little bit. So a little bit too much. There we go. So our focus is equitable, clean transportation programs because we view these really as being key parts of California's clean air safety net. People of color are more than 60% likely to live with unhealthy air, making it one of the clearest examples of environmental racism in California. Transportation is the largest driver of climate change as well as smog in the state. About 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector once you account for upstream sources, and 80% of our smog-forming pollutants. Additionally, 95% of the toxic carcinogenic diesel particulate matter is from the transportation sector. Yet, despite all of this, California still subsidizes fossil fuels and fossil fuel consumption, either through direct subsidies to the oil industry or through highway expansion projects, and something that we'll discuss a little bit further in the future. Unfortunately, at the same time that we're cutting our climate priorities, we are still funding these very programs that work against our climate priorities. Next slide. So this information, there was just hot off the press information yesterday, but at least in 2023, 98% of Californians live in a region earning an F grade for air quality. That includes myself, being a resident of Southern California. We are in the smoggy, the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Inland Empire region is the smoggiest air basin in the nation. The Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley dominates particulate matter pollution, although certainly the LA region is also in the top 10 for that. I know the American Lung Association does their annual State of the Air report, which has a lot of which really shows how extreme our air pollution challenges are. Next slide. So this air pollution has real effects on people. They are living sicker lives and ultimately shorter lives. At least 7,500 people are dying prematurely every year from air pollution in California. For example, even in my own neighborhood, I live in the western side of Long Beach, and my zip code has a 9 to 8 year shorter lifespan than somebody on the eastern side of the city. So, that really goes to show that level of disparity just in one city. And we're not even, the most extreme. North Long Beach, in certain parts of the West Side, also have even more extreme disparities in health and life outcomes. Next slide. And in addition to being sicker also is costly. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't have that the same access to healthcare. And air pollution causes asthma. I had asthma as a kid. My cousin who grew up in the same neighborhood as I had asthma as a kid. And hospital visits, ER visits, all costs really have an impact on people's budget. And it costs up to $1,600 a year on average for what air pollution costs people in California. Next slide. So clearly, everyone everywhere should have the option to have clean transportation because that helps with clean air. And I know a lot of our focus on this is EVs, but when we talk about EVs, it's important to remember we're not just talking about passenger vehicles, but we're also talking about transit vehicles, and we're also talking about medium and heavy duty trucks, which is a significant driver of that pollution as well. So what we do know is that EVs cut toxic fumes that are polluting to our communities and overheating our planet. They should not just be for the elites. We'll have to correct that, so that part of the slide. They should not just be for the elites. They need to be for everybody who wants one, and they need to be practical. And they are here and now, and they need to be for families and businesses across the state and made accessible for everybody. Next slide. So, when we talk about the proposals for the legislature, or the governor's proposal for the budget, this is sort of a breakdown of what he has actually proposed. This is based off of his January proposal. We are coming up to the May revise, which is coming up soon. So we have the governor's proposed $600 million in cuts to clean transportation and equity programs in the form of a delay. So what he is proposing is taking funding that is slated for 2024, 2025, and moving that out to future years, specifically some programs as late as 2 years in 2027, 2028. That is after his term. That even though that they are promising to fulfill that funding in the future, that essentially means that programs will receive zero funding in this year's budget if the governor's proposal were to go through. $200 million cut from the active transportation program, the only major transportation infrastructure program with a floor for investment in disadvantaged communities. Also proposed is a $45 million cut from the Clean Cars for All funding. Last year, it was only provided $28 million. Clearly, in the Clean Cars for All program, for those that don't know, our focus is specifically on low-income and disadvantaged community residents. $100 million cuts in drayage truck funds that cut air pollution in port communities near warehouses. And basically, these delays and cuts extends the governor's proposed $10 billion ZEV package that was first developed in 2021 from a 5-year plan to a 7-year plan. And again, that actually extends out beyond the governor's term and does not propose to make up the funding that would be cut in the short term. He has also proposed to shift nearly $1 billion from the Trade and Intercity Rail Capital Program into also shifting funding into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, reducing funding available to other climate investments as well. Next slide. So to give people a choice of clean transportation saving lives, we put together a letter, what we would like to see in the budget. Again, we know this is a very challenging budget year for everybody, and tough decisions are going to have to be made. However, we did want to put out what a budget should ideally look like. So next slide. So we believe that the budget should avoid further delays and cuts to clean transportation and not putting the state off course of fulfilling the $10 billion ZEV package, as well as not delaying the emission reductions that are needed to meet our climate and clean air commitments. Next slide. We also, want to make sure that we are cutting fossil fuel subsidies, freeway expansions, and other projects that pollute and work against our climate goals and commitments. Next slide. We want to focus our clean air investments on equity-centered programs. So again, targeting programs in communities that have the greatest barriers to clean transportation and the greatest health needs in the state, and really focusing in on those low-income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. We also want to make sure that our climate investments are elevating low-income and disadvantaged rural communities, as those communities are oftentimes overlooked and actually have started their own programs on their own without much private assistance, or without much oftentimes without much public assistance. The Coachella Valley and Imperial Valley and Central Coast are particular locations where organizations have taken that sort of local leadership. Next slide. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're creating a stable, dedicated funding source for clean transportation programs. Typically, we've always relied on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. In recent years, we've also taken, the general fund revenues have been used for clean transportation as well. However, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is under a number of different stressors. It has a number of different programs it's supporting. And as discussed earlier by Amy, the general fund is very volatile and can go up and down in terms of how much revenues it's able to provide.
Chris, you have about 30 seconds now.
Yep. Next slide. So these are the groups that supported our Invest in Clean Air Ask, and very broad coalition from environmental to labor and beyond, and businesses. So next slide. And so we, again, our main ask is to give people choices that clean our air and save lives, and please save our clean air safety net. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. We really appreciated that, especially the specifics around what is being cut. We are now joined by Senator Scott Wiener. Senator, thank you for joining us. Senator Wiener represents California's District 11 since 2016 and has championed significant climate action through landmark legislation such as a pioneering climate law mandating corporate greenhouse gas disclosures and substantial investments in clean energy storage. His legislative efforts are crucial in positioning California as a leader in environmental sustainability and renewable energy initiatives. He is the chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Senator Wiener.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you do for the climate, for climate action in California. We're making a lot of strides in California. Of course, the massive investment that we made a few years ago to supplement the investment for the Inflation Reduction Act is just tremendous, and we all want to make sure that we continue aggressively in this direction. Of course, we face a very, very challenging budget year. We took some early action to try to at least reduce the scale of what we're going to have to grapple with in the next less than 60 days. And I know, so many of us are, want to be very, very careful that we're not undermining California's climate action work in our balancing of the budget. With that said, I can't predict exactly what's going to happen. We are currently, working internally in the Senate in terms of prioritizing what we want to, protect and what could be subject to reduction or delay. And of course, we're going to have to work with the Assembly and with the governor. So I can't predict exactly what's going to happen. We do know that we have various options, and I would just encourage you to keep advocating to make sure that our climate investments, and particularly the absolutely most core climate investments, are continuing to move forward. On a policy level, we also have to make sure that we're doing what we can to promote sustainable land use patterns, sustainable transportation, I've been very vocal that, in my humble opinion, the environmental movement has not usually been as focused as it should be on housing policy, because housing is absolutely a climate issue. And if we are not zoning and expeditiously permitting and allowing to be built dense infill housing in existing communities, if we're making that hard or impossible, then that will induce more and more sprawl, which destroys natural spaces, builds in wildfire zones, and leads to much higher VMT and carbon emissions. In addition, we know that infill and that kind of dense housing uses less energy, uses less water, and so forth. And so housing is a climate policy. It's an environmental issue, or it's a climate issue, an environmental issue. And I really encourage more environmental organizations to make housing a core part of your mission. I think that there are environmental organizations that I think stay away from housing because the politics around housing are really, really intense. And unfortunately, there are some environmental organizations, I'm not saying the Climate Center falls in this category, but some who are actively oppositional to making it easier to build more dense infill housing so that we can have more walkable and bikeable communities and people can drive shorter distances. So I just want to really express that because I think it's something that does not always have the space that it should have within the environmental movement. I also just want to stress the challenges that we have around public transportation in the Bay Area, where we have robust transit systems. We were able to delay the so-called fiscal cliff, the operational shortfalls that are going to result in significant service cuts to transit in the Bay Area. We delayed it by a few years with work in the budget last year. Thank you to everyone who helped us with that. But the fiscal cliff will still hit in 2026. And so we are working on authorizing legislation for a regional revenue measure for Bay Area public transportation systems. And so there's a lot of work to be done. I'm proud of the work that we have done, expanding energy storage, continuing to expand clean transportation options with electric vehicles and charging stations. We wanted to go faster, but we are making progress. And with just so many aspects of climate action that California is leading on, and we need to continue to lead on. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, Senator Wiener. And we know that you're on a tight time schedule. Would you be able to answer a question or two?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we do have one question, which is, do you think the state can get to its climate goals with the cuts and delays in the governor's budget proposal?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Do you think that the state can get to its climate goals with the cuts and delays currently in the governor's budget proposal?
I think we can. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. We are in a bad budget year, and so we're looking at when you look at climate, when you look at housing, when you look at services for folks with developmental disabilities, support for foster kids, for seniors, for K through 12 public schools, for UC and CSU. These are all incredibly important areas of work in California where we have huge challenges, and we're going to have to make some painful cuts. I think it's important that we minimize the climate cuts, and a deferral is better than a cut, and we want to be strategic. And I think it's important for folks who are focused on this to focus on, of course, we want to, if having no cuts would be great, or minimal cuts would be great, and you should fight for that, but also focusing on what are the things that would be most harmful and where there's the greatest time sensitivity in terms of protecting those dollars. The good news is that because of the sheer scale of the investment we made, over $50 billion, it creates more flexibility in terms of protecting the things that are most essential. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question that touches upon a very urgent issue right now is, given the narrow victory of Prop 1 and the limited amount estimated for all bonds, are you feeling more or less optimistic about a climate bond? And are people focusing more on the budget now?
I am cautiously optimistic that we have a path for one or two bonds this November. And I know, as you know, there are three under discussion: housing, climate, and school facilities. These are all obviously very important. I think my personal view is a climate bond has been waiting for a number of years. I feel like for as long as I've been in the Senate, every year we have a conversation about a climate bond, and it gets deferred for various reasons, and bonds are always complicated politics. But I do hope that we will see a climate bond, and I think there is a path. And so I would encourage you to keep advocating to the governor and to members of the legislature.
Thank you so much. And may I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So wait, let me find it. It's really good. Where did it go? Oh, what do you think is the most effective way for folks like us and those who care about climate to influence the budget process, especially as we're so concerned about climate investments?
I think that coalitions are very powerful, and the environmental movement, and the climate movement certainly, I think, is skilled at this. Moving together with a big coalition of organizations to say, here's what we want, and here are the highest priorities to protect. I think that is very powerful, and that will get noticed both by the governor and in the legislature. And then, of course, always it's always really powerful when a member of the legislature is in their local community. People approach you at an event or on the street to say, hey, I hope you'll, keep in mind this incredibly important pot of money. That's just really impactful on members, not just on climate issues, but on any issue.
Great. Thank you so much. We don't want to keep you because we were informed that you were tight on time this morning. But we did want to thank you again for making the time to join us and to share your thoughts on these important issues, especially given your leadership position in the Senate. So thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your work.
You're welcome. Okay, we do have some other questions. And I apologize. I know there were a ton of questions for Senator Wiener, but we only had time for a few. I have a question for Amy Costa, specifically related to the budget. If you could share with us how much is being proposed to be cut and delayed from climate priorities, what has already been agreed to in the early action proposal by the legislature, and what is still in play, if you know that?
All great questions. So Senator Wiener kind of talked about the historic investment in climate. So in 21-22, the state budget acts provided about $54 billion in climate across what we call the multi-year. So that's not in one year, it's across several fiscal years. The 23 budget reduced that to $52 billion. And then most recently, the January budget proposed $48.3 billion. And now it's across 7 years. And so this is what Senator Wiener was talking a little bit about with the deferrals. So it's like taking that money and pushing it out into the future. They did just act on an early action plan, and this is a way for them to try and find some savings in the current year to reduce the operating deficit they need to deal with in budget year and beyond. And so in the early action plan, one of the things that's notable that the subcommittees have been talking about is that they did to the tune of about $1.7 billion, again, across multiple fiscal years, shift some of the programs in climate that were funded in the general fund to the greenhouse gas reduction fund. And what they haven't done is they haven't decided what those programs are quite yet. So they've scored the savings, but they haven't quite decided which is going to be shifted over. And most of the committees have said that that's going to be kind of an ongoing conversation. As far as what's in play, as we all know, we all just paid our taxes. We're going to find out in May revise. I think, there's a question about whether or not revenues are going to continue to deteriorate, frankly, in the May revise. And so, I think it's not looking particularly rosy personally. And so that means it creates more pressure on the general fund and in turn, more pressure on some of these climate programs. Lastly, one of the things that came out of the early action plan was a freeze letter. I've talked about this before. The administration always has the ability to freeze expenditures in their own entities, departments, and agencies. And they did create a new process here where they've asked the administration to work with the Joint Legislative Budget Committee on these freezes and in turn to score those savings in May revise. And so what that means is I say it's like looking under the couch cushions, like they're literally looking for programs that have funds that have not gone out the door or are not encumbered. And so that also will impact sort of what's at play, what savings they're able to kind of find there. So hopefully that's helpful.
That's very helpful, Amy. Thank you for going into a little bit more detail on that. Chris, I have a question for you. It would be great to hear more about the dollar amount advocates believe Clean Cars for All would need to operate effectively over the next 2 years. CARB shared in the Assembly Budget Subcommittee 4 hearing that they hope to prioritize the CVA program over Clean Cars for All in the future, and I wanted to hear your thoughts. If you could also explain what CVA is, that would be great.
Sure. So first of all, Clean Cars for All is one of the state's programs to advocate or to help incentivize EV ownership. For many of you on this call, you're probably familiar with the now defunct CVRP or California Vehicle or the rebate project, the vehicle rebate project. That was an incentive to purchase an electric vehicle. Clean Cars for All is the low income and disadvantaged community focused program. And that program is still operational. For those who aren't familiar with it, it is currently implemented within 5 air districts within California: South Coast, Bay Area, Sacramento, San Diego, and San Joaquin Valley. And then CARB is also in the process and should be, what we're hearing soon, starting up a statewide Clean Cars for All program that will coexist with the 5 current existing ones. In terms of the funding amount, typically this program has usually received between about $70 to $80 million a year. I think that is a starting point for discussion because there's also some question about how much it's actually able to provide in terms of subsidies, especially in light of increased rebate amounts authorized in prior budgets, and in the CARB's annual funding plan for clean transportation. So I think, again, a starting point is around $70 to $80 million. Last year's budget provided $28 million, split 2 ways, half of it going to the existing district programs and half of it going to the statewide program. Additionally, prior budgets actually allocated funding to the statewide program, which again hasn't launched yet. So that funding is already there and waiting to be used, and it's encumbered by CARB specifically for the statewide program. Though we are pushing for a change which would allow them to use that funding a bit more interchangeably with the district-based programs. So I think again, the starting point would be about $70 to $80 million in a normal budget year, and really focusing in on those district-based programs which are currently operating and have current operational needs, whereas the statewide program will need to be ramped up and has yet to start, and has funding already allocated to it from prior years.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that thoughtful answer.
And then there was on the CVA program. admittedly, I'm not as familiar with that program, but that's the Vehicle Financing Assistance Program, which is focused on rather than like rebate vouchers for directly purchasing a car, that CVA focuses on the loan side of it. And there's a couple different programs. One is I know there was a small Bay Area program for a bit. There's also been the CARB is also looking at starting a statewide program, kind of conjoined with the statewide Clean Cars for All program. So in terms of the specific questions, or what program should we focus on? I think that CARB is particularly interested because it is tied into that statewide expansion for Clean Cars for All, for the CVA program. I think in terms of kind of how we view it, again, it's a question of where the immediate need is and what yields the maximum result for its key constituencies. We know Clean Cars for All is proven. I think CVA, it certainly has a lot of great work has been done in it, which is not trying to diminish the value of that program. But certainly we know that there have been some very impactful things done through Clean Cars for All.
Thank you. Thanks for circling back to that question. Amy, I have an interesting question for you. What
Hopefully you know the answer then, Geraldine.
Well, just share your thoughts. What do you think the solution is to California's cycle of boom and bust revenue? How can we ensure consistent funding for climate priorities?
Yeah, it's an age-old question. There's been a lot of conversations about this in policy circles over the years, and it's difficult. Like I said, I mean, we have, and a lot of times it's been through the initiative process, impacted our budget, specifically on the revenue side. And, we've decided, and the voters have decided, to have a fairly progressive personal income tax. We're limited because of Prop 13. If you look at other states, like New York as an example, property tax is more available to fund kind of these programs. And so we kind of have a history here as an activist state with a strong initiative process of doing some things. I do think that Prop 2, the Budget Stabilization Act, was a way to kind of smooth out some of this by creating reserves. And I have to say, even though the news looks kind of sour right now, we are better placed as a state to deal with this kind of downturn than we have been traditionally because of the Budget Stabilization Act and some other reserve funds that we have. And so, I think, and there's people who are way more political than me on this webinar, those tax measures and trying to change that are incredibly difficult politically. And property tax in particular kind of has a religion around it here in California, which would make it, I think, difficult to see changes there right now anyway.
Thank you. I remember when Prop 13 was passed, and it was like, you're not going to have any more field trips anymore. When I was in elementary school, that was sort of the message I got. Chris, another question was, considering budget constraints and other needs, what else should be cut other than fossil fuel subsidies? How much should we invest in electric vehicle passenger vehicles compared to public transit and smart urban design?
So in terms of picking and choosing, like what sort of things that we absolutely want to prioritize, one thing we certainly want to make sure it's part of the discussion is the medium and heavy duty programs. So again, those medium and heavy duty trucks have massive impacts to low income and disadvantaged communities. They have produce large amounts of diesel particulate matter, which is the number one air toxic in our air. And there's a disproportionate share of the pollution comes from the medium and heavy duty sector. So we definitely want to prioritize that. I am hesitant to say that we should, cut Clean Cars for All, for example, or financing assistance or clean mobility. We also want to make sure we're talking about clean mobility as part of the discussion as well, because that does have, that focuses on ways to get out of cars and actually using transit, micromobility, things along those lines. So we also want to make sure that that is part of the discussion as well. Infrastructure is also another key thing that we need to keep in mind, in making sure that we have the ability to support these vehicles. But again, if there are other programs that we really want to elevate or highlight, I would certainly say those three: medium and heavy duty, clean mobility, and infrastructure all need to be part of the discussion and included in that as well. One thing I did want to mention as far as other options for revenue, one of the big things that we want to make sure is, there's a lot of discussion about a climate bond. So including an air quality component in the climate bond is absolutely important. One, because it does create a new, more stable revenue stream for those programs. But also, when you look at it from a political angle, clean air is popular, and it certainly would help, I think, to include a clean air section in the overall climate bond in terms of when you present the arguments to the voters.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Amy, for such thoughtful, off-the-cuff responses to the questions that we're getting in the chat and in the Q&A. I wanted to take this time to very quickly do something I would have done at the beginning of the meeting, but we were having technical issues, and unfortunately, we got a little bit rushed. I wanted to share our webinar sponsors slide. These are the folks without whom these webinars couldn't happen. Silicon Valley Clean Energy, SunPower, River City Bank, LA Department of Water and Power, Sunrun, MCE, Sonoma Clean Power, Peninsula Clean Energy, RNA, and Calpine. And also wanted to take a quick opportunity to thank our promo partners. I'm not going to read them all off, but we are very grateful for all the support that we get, both from our sponsors and from our promotional partners. So thank you for allowing me to do that, because otherwise I would have felt poorly about not thanking our supporters. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Sneha Ayagadi of the Greenlining Institute, who will talk about building decarbonizations and other equity programs taking a hit from the climate from the climate budget cuts. So Sneha, please.
Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm excited to be here with everyone. Are the slides ready? Great, thank you so much. So my name is Sneha Ayagadi. I am a Senior Program Manager for Clean Energy Initiatives at the Greenlining Institute. And we are an economic, climate, and racial justice policy organization working towards a future where communities of color can build wealth, live in healthy places filled with economic opportunity, and are ready to meet the challenges posed by climate change. And the purpose of my presentation today is to highlight 3 critical climate equity programs that should be preserved in the state budget. And this is really important because we see an ongoing trend, not just this year, but of funding for climate equity programs being promised and then moved to future years and subsequently cut. So in order to make sure the programs actually reach the communities that can benefit the most from them, we need to break that cycle. Next slide, please. Thank you. Low-income communities of color, one back, please. In California are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change, and decades of systemic disinvestment have limited capacity to carry out steps needed to achieve their own visions of climate resilience, even though they have the deepest knowledge of what's needed in their community. So over 5 grant rounds, the Transformative Climate Communities Program, or TCC, is a solution that has funded disadvantaged communities to plan and implement coordinated climate projects like rooftop solar, affordable housing near transit, and tree planting to reduce greenhouse gases holistically while promoting multiple community benefits. As you can see from the graphic on the left, it's had a lot of direct, meaningful impacts. And TCC is meant to be a catalytic investment to help communities access more funding. Several TCC communities now have the capacity to apply for federal climate funding through programs that are coming through the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal legislation, because they've had the experience of coming together and applying for grants and making their visions come true through TCC. And there's a huge demand for this program, with only 11 out of 31, so roughly a third of applications in this latest round, round 5, receiving funding. And there have been several evaluations of the program, including one published by UCLA, that show that TCC has really been a model for federal programs, including the EPA's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And it's also cited as a key exemplar in the Department of Energy's Justice 40 guidance. And despite overwhelming support for the program, with support from over 60 advocates in communities across California, this is seen as a leading example. The program was zeroed out in 2023 and in the governor's January 2024 proposed budget, cutting over $200 million in critical funding from the program. And we asked that this funding that was promised is restored to invest in community-led solutions in California's communities that are most impacted by climate change, pollution, and economic burdens. Next slide, please. The next program I'll talk about is the Regional Climate Collaboratives. This was a program that's designed to fund local cross-sector collaboratives to conduct capacity building activities and really help small community-based organizations from under-resourced communities to access the climate investments by developing partnership, leadership, and knowledge. And you can see on the left, in the first round, RCC awarded about $8.35 billion. And this went towards creating climate collaboratives and including for tribal organizations and community action plans. This program is very popular, with requests for funding far exceeding the amount that's allocated. And you can see that the program is oversubscribed by 8 to 10 times on the chart on the right. And there was proposed to be a second round, and actually many organizations applied from all over the state. And 273 organizations collectively spent time, energy, and resources preparing and applying for round 2 funding, with some groups spending up to 600 hours and $20,000 of their own resources. But the governor's proposal cut the $9.8 million as reserved for round 2 1 month before the Strategic Growth Council, the agency that's administering the program, was going to release awardees. And the impact was huge. We surveyed applicants from round 2 and found that 80% were counting on this grant to bring together the stakeholders and plan to be able to apply for other state and federal dollars. And we know that there's a budget deficit, but at the same time, we think that capacity building is really a great strategy in deficit years, because this is a relatively small amount of money. And if you look at the overall climate budget, and enabling communities that have already put in the time and the effort to apply to get this funding will set them up for being able to access future funding, which is really essential. So we're urging the governor and the legislature to restore the $10 million that communities already spent time and energy applying for, so they'll be able to access further funding to make their climate resilience visions come true. Next slide, please. The last program I'll talk about is the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. So this is a first of a kind equity-driven program that seeks to help low-income households transition to cleaner sources of energy within their homes. So it's unique, and it's really unique because it has been designed with heavy input from a lot of advocates to enable direct installed remediation, health and safety repairs, which isn't included in a lot of other building decarbonization measures. It also really includes strong tenant protections, and then it also includes community-based organizations in the project team to support implementation, which makes sure that the program can really reach the communities that could benefit the most. However, the EBD funding is at risk of being cut by $293 million per the proposed budget, which is a 30% reduction. And this will really have the most impact on those that could use it the most, including those that live in multifamily affordable housing. And there's a really great article in Capital and Maine that kind of covers the impacts that this potential budget cut would have on residents and also on operators of affordable housing. And the last point I want to make here is that the argument that's being made is that federal funding will be able to offset some of these cuts. And while we're really excited about the federal funding and it's very much needed, currently only 60% of the homes funding, which is one of the federal sources, is allotted to go to support the EBD program. And that 60% also has more restrictions than the current EBD program guidelines. And even with the federal funds, this cut would still amount to a cut of over $100 million for the proposed funding. And even though the program originally promised money is still a drop in the bucket for how much money is really needed to be able to decarbonize our low-income housing. Next slide, please. So in summary, we urge the legislature to take action to restore funding for these key programs. And I just wanted to share the words of one Round 2 RCC applicant. Small community-based organizations have been told by their local, regional, and state government that they need to be present and active and pursue grant opportunities. But when we do, expending hundreds of staff hours and thousands of dollars, we have the rug pulled underneath us and told that our applications won't even be reviewed. That's time and money that we should have spent helping our residents that we won't get back. Why would we ever put effort to apply for one of these grant programs again? So the state can really break the cycle of disinvestment by investing in these programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sneha. That's really eye-opening. And that 9.8 million, which is a relatively small amount, has the potential to do so much. It's sort of like a ripple in the pond, and it's been summarily cut. So that's very upsetting, especially considering how much time and energy folks spent on the applications, and then a month before they were going to find out, it's just gone. So thank you for sharing. Really appreciate your perspective. Next, I'm going to introduce my own colleague, Bonnie Bonawall. I think it might be Benawal, I apologize, who's going to talk to us about passing a climate bond that supports longer-term climate investment. Bonnie?
Awesome. Thank you, Geraldine. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this really important conversation. As Geraldine mentioned, I wanted to follow up on the bond that's been touched on several times today and provide a little bit more color on why a climate bond is so critical this year and where the current prospects lie. So we know that California has been a leader on climate action, not just nationally, but around the world, right? We've done a fantastic job in setting laudable targets to get us to a climate safe future, but to put meaning behind these targets, these numbers on paper, funding is absolutely critical, right? That's why we're all here today. And this funding must be two important things. It must be increased and it must be sustained. Now, we saw this increase back in 2022 when the state enjoyed a $100 billion surplus, but so many of these investments have been rolled back since then in last year's final budget and are continuing to be rolled back through the significant cuts and delays that the speakers before me have been talking about. And in last year's January budget, the governor pointed to a climate bond to justify a lot of the cuts that he had proposed, and we absolutely need him to follow through on that promise. Now, this boom and bust cycle with the state budget that's been mentioned is not a new phenomenon, right? And there's no reason to believe that this cycle won't continue. So we need another consistent and stable funding mechanism that can deliver on the targets that we set, and therein the promise to Californians to equip them with the critical solutions needed to weather climate disasters. And a robust climate bond is that answer. Right? I mean, it's not a silver bullet by any means, but, and we still need continued and sustained funding from the state budget, but a bond will certainly help buffer the cuts that climate programs have been accruing over the last couple of years. And very importantly, as Sneha mentioned, it will allow programs and projects that are already underway, but are now in a holding pattern because of funding uncertainty, it will allow them to move forward. Now, bonds provide years of funding for critical programs that we just don't have the luxury of deciding on every year, right? Their effectiveness depends on continuity. And we know that climate impacts every Californian, whether it's wildfire risk, flooding devastation, deadly heat waves, air pollution, drought. I don't need to go on. You all get the picture, right? Climate affects everyone. And Californians deserve to at least get the opportunity to decide for themselves if this is something that they want to fund on the ballot. And spoiler alert, polling does show that the issues that are baked into the various climate bonds, whether it be clean air, clean water, wildfire protection, etc., they are issues that Californians care a great deal about. Now, when it comes to the current bond landscape, there are several climate bond proposals out there, and I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you right now, but just stick with me here. We have AB 1567 by Assemblymember Garcia and SB 867 by Senator Allen, which are for $15 billion each, as well as several other smaller bonds, such as the Food and Farming Bond by Assemblymember Wilson, which is for $3.4 billion, an offshore wind bond by Assemblymember Zabur for $1 billion, and a flood protection bond by Senator Eggman for $4 billion. And along with these climate bonds, there are two other bonds that the legislature is currently considering, and those revolve around the issues of education and housing. Now, the administration has identified a limited capacity of total bond debt that the state is willing to accrue, and that is $16 billion in total. So if you add up all those numbers, we know that the math is not mathing here, right? We know that if a climate bond is to move forward, it's going to get a major haircut. Now, the prioritization of these three bond issues that are in play, climate, education, and housing, the prioritization varies between the two chambers, and we'll have to see how it all shakes out in the next 2 months before June 27th, which is when the deadline is for the legislature to pass a ballot or pass a bond to make it onto the November ballot. Now, quickly before my time is up here, I do want to talk a bit about one other critical area of funding that hasn't been highlighted in the webinar so far, and that is nature-based solutions. Now, I'm talking about solutions such as the better management of our forests to reduce wildfire risk and increase water supply, regenerative agricultural practices like cover cropping and compost application that increase the soil health and farm worker protections, to urban forestry programs that provide reprieve from the urban heat island effect, to the myriad of other proven solutions on the various land types that we have here in California. Now, these solutions have gained a lot more traction over the past several years, including on the international stage at this last year's COP. And very importantly, they've become more integrated into our overall climate action toolbox here in California. And with the passage of AB 1757 a couple of years ago, an expert advisory committee was established and ended up finding that our land sector can provide up to 400 million metric tons of GHG benefits in the near term, which is a contribution that absolutely cannot be ignored if we want to be on the right trajectory to meet our climate targets, which the LAO says is a trajectory that we are not currently on. And we know that nature-based solutions provide many benefits beyond GHG reductions and carbon sequestration. They provide adaptation and resiliency benefits that other sectors, such as energy and transportation, don't typically enjoy themselves. And to that end, just this past Monday on Earth Day, the Natural Resources Agency released a new set of nature-based solutions targets. And this is a first in California history. And these targets provide a roadmap to where the state needs to invest. Now, for a safe and livable future, one in which we are both mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis, California needs to invest in its land sector akin to the funding that has historically been provided to the energy and transportation sectors. And the climate bond is a necessary place to do just that. So with that, I will stop and I will pass it back to Geraldine. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. There's so much going on right now with respect to the climate bond, and it's very difficult to follow because as you and Senator Wiener mentioned, there are 3 under consideration, one for climate, one for housing, one for education. And so how that's all going to play out in the budget process is going to be very interesting. So thank you for sharing all that. So our call to action, we're waiting for Assemblymember Connolly to join us. He should be joining us momentarily. But our call to action and his topic of conversation is actually the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and prioritization of climate investments. So as you know, well, you may know, we actually, the state of California, provide subsidies to oil and gas corporations on an annual basis. We provide subsidies and tax breaks that add up to millions, if not billions of dollars every year. And these tax breaks and subsidies are made available to fossil fuel corporations, even as they take in record profits. So with all of the needs that we've identified through our various speakers today, all the different things that are at risk for clean air and climate, they could be restored possibly if the fossil fuel subsidies were eliminated. So we've dropped in the chat a place where you can click and you can send your message to the governor if you feel so inclined, letting him know that those fossil fuel subsidies and tax breaks should be eliminated, especially in this drastic budget year, and climate investments should be prioritized based on all the information that we've discussed today. So that's in the chat, the call to action. And I'll put it in again in case you missed it. And it takes you directly to a web page where you can put in your information and the message will go directly to the governor's office. Oh, and we have been joined by Assemblymember Connolly. I'll take just a moment to introduce him. Assemblymember Damon Connolly, with nearly 2 decades of public service, has significantly advanced renewable energy and climate policies in California, notably as a founding board member of Marin Clean Energy, and a leader in setting Marin County on a path toward 100% renewable energy. Currently, he champions environmental sustainability and community welfare as chair of the Select Committee on Wildfire Prevention, and as a member of several key legislative committees focused on climate and energy, including serving on the Assembly Budget Subcommittee 4 on the climate crisis, resources, energy, and transportation. Assemblymember, we're so glad you were able to join us today, and I pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see everyone this morning. Kind of at the end of a fairly busy week up here, and you may have heard from a couple of my colleagues already. It's the last week where all policy committees hear bills before they move on to appropriations. Not surprisingly, a lot of my work has evolved around climate issues, energy, and particularly renewable energy solutions. And then kind of a swing for the fence proposal right now in the context of our budget process right now that I'll talk a little bit about. And it ties into a broader issue right now of reducing or eliminating oil and gas subsidies, which cost our state billions of dollars every year. I see a real opportunity to change the narrative there in a situation where we know we're facing a lot of budget challenges. And I don't need to tell you about those. It still amazes me that we seemingly went from a large surplus to a massive deficit within only a few years. But the real world impacts that we're seeing are that there are a number of cuts being proposed that would do significant damage to a lot of the great progress we made through the budget and otherwise over the last few years toward actually funding and achieving our climate objectives as a state. We had a press conference yesterday. Thank you for the Climate Center and others for participating in that. I think it's a really sound message. As we face those fiscal challenges, why not look to the very industries that are causing the harm, causing the pollution, to actually step in and fund those programs? It's also a matter of fairness. These are the industries that are causing harm. There's no question about it to our communities, particularly our most vulnerable communities. As a quick aside, and some of you know, I'm very proud of the fact that I was one of the leaders of efforts when I was a county supervisor in my prior job to actually have Marin and several other local jurisdictions sue the major oil corporations who do business in California and worldwide toward getting damages that would reflect the sea level rise that their policies are creating and other harms, premised on the fact that these corporations knew that their products were causing harm to the climate and environment and systematically concealed that, if not lied about it, over time. So we're certainly anxiously continuing to see where that lawsuit may go as well. So we know we need to continue to make climate investments. I'm talking to strong allies in that regard. We know, particularly in my neck of the woods, which is all of Marin and a good portion of Sonoma County, and frankly, elsewhere in the state, we're looking at our state's experience with massive wildfires in recent years, many of which were sparked by aging utility infrastructure and lack of critical funding. So there's several strategies we're using. One, and I'm very happy to serve on Budget Subcom 4, as was noted, we're pushing back on cuts. We are keeping these issues front and center as priorities we need to be focused on and staying the course. Again, through the good work that's been going on through the last several years. Number two, let's look at closing tax breaks and subsidies. Number three, we are actively now in working on literally a working group and obviously discussions with stakeholders about how a climate bond may look later this year to bring before the voters. We think there's a strong case to be made. As to be expected, possibly there are other needs that are also being evaluated for other bonds, including education, most notably, and potentially housing. The Senate is also doing a form of a climate bond now. Our sense is the governor is kind of leaving it to the legislature right now on what a ultimate climate bond could look like. He's more focused on education, at least from a leadership point of view right now. I like where the discussions are going. There are some differences right now in the versions. There is also the issue of, I think we started out ambitiously. If you look at the needs we're talking about and the scale, we were originally looking at something like $10 to $15 billion. Right now, we are in the process of at least gaming out, will that number have to come down? Most likely, yes. So starting from like a $10 billion spot, 8, and we'll take it from there through ongoing negotiations as well. So a lot, I think, can be accomplished through a climate bond. I would love your input on what you're hearing out in the community. Is this something the public could support? My sense is yes. I think the polling is bearing out on that issue. Yeah, thank you for the some of the chat comments coming in on that. When you look at tangible things like wildfire prevention and mitigation, things like clean water and air, just basics, everyone is entitled to. We need to get serious about electrifying our grid and our buildings, et cetera. That's well known now, and it's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be overnight. But again, now is the time not to lose momentum around that. I have introduced some interesting legislation as well as that other work I just outlined, which is kind of ongoing. Namely around, let's get serious about how are we going to meet our clean energy goals and our greenhouse gas reduction goals. I happen to believe customer side solar, i.e. rooftop solar, is a part of that. There have been some recent decisions by the CPUC that effectively have, if not gutted, significantly reduced incentives toward people installing rooftop solar on their homes, namely through what's called net energy metering. I know most of you are familiar with that, where people are compensated reasonably for overproducing on their own homes. It's a stated strategy, right, that the state has adopted. Yet we find ourselves kind of going in the opposite direction in terms of action right now. So I at least wanted to tee up that issue. It's very unlikely my bill will go forward this year, but I think the conversation is broader right now. There's other kind of related issues around utility rates and charges. The microgrid concept is, and I know climate centers all over that, is very interesting to me. If we can use that as a method to not only enhance green energy, but kind of local security and control, like in the event of a wildfire incident, rather than a power safety shut off, to actually have the ability to island off that and create good jobs as well on a community level. So with that, why don't I stop? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to suggest about 30 seconds. So we have a few
Yeah, no,
minutes for
literally
question and
that
answer.
was the end. We could go on a lot longer, but also would love to hear any questions or comments from your end.
Well, we have one question that I think is particularly interesting, which is, if we do cut the fossil fuel subsidies, will those funds be directed, or could those funds be directed to climate investments, or would they revert to the general fund?
So probably both. They certainly would revert to the general fund. So initially what would happen is that Proposition 98 would come into play and have to be satisfied. No argument there. So I think the last thing we want to do is kind of pit the school system against something we're trying to do. So the funds would revert to, because they are taxes, it would revert to the general fund. Prop 98 would take hold. And then I think from that point forward, though, I like the idea of exploring ways of actually directing the money through the budget process toward the actual needs that we're talking about. I think that's kind of how we've been pitching it, broad stroke wise. So thank you for that feedback. I am actually requesting a hearing on Water's Edge. So the specific subsidy I'm targeting is Water's Edge, which you may be familiar with, which is how large multinational corporations are taxed, or in this case, not taxed, vis-a-vis what's happening in California versus worldwide. which we would argue still has an impact on California. So it's not the first time this idea has been brought up. And again, there's a broader context around oil and gas subsidies as well. But I think it would be a pretty elegant solution to actually signal that money would move after everything's taken out, would move back toward the very cuts or added funding scenarios that we're talking about.
Thank you. I really appreciate your response. Another question that actually has to do with sort of find more ways to gain revenue. A question's been asked. Europe has managed to attain a lower carbon economy, mainly with higher energy costs. Can't we expand cap and trade so that it covers climate damage and reduces our greenhouse gas output?
Again, you're spot on in timeliness on raising a key issue. So cap and trade is up for renewal within the next year. That issue, or at most 2 years, that issue should be taken up. The speaker just informed me that there will be a cap and trade working group. I'm going to be on it as to evaluating how or what reauthorization looks like. There are a number of issues that have been raised. Frankly, also even just the overall dilemma of the concept, where on one hand, we want revenue, on the other hand, we want reduced levels of emissions, which effectively over time is designed to reduce revenue under that scheme. So that's a given. But in the meantime, how can we structure it to maximize reductions, but also be able to generate some revenue that can go toward the goals that we're talking about now? So I'm actually really looking forward to that discussion, as I think a lot of people are. It's timely right now, so would love to keep in touch on that discussion as well, let alone how to use the GGRF funds, right? That's always a parlor game around here as well, especially in tight times.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. We also have a couple of questions for our speakers who were talking to our attendees prior to your coming on board. Bonnie, if you could come back on screen, I have a question for you relating to the bond proposal, the climate bond proposal. What are the issues that the environmental justice communities have come together and are supporting for funding? How much is that in the bond proposal?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. You know, given the various climate bond proposals out there that I spoke about earlier, over 150 environmental and environmental justice groups came together at the end of last year around a new bond proposal for a total of $10 billion that provides funding for a lot of critical areas. And I have the list in front of me. It would be flood protection, sustainable agriculture, wildfire resilience, biodiversity, extreme heat, coastal protection, and outdoor access, and clean air. And it's really important to note that these investments follow the Justice 40 principle of directing 40% of all funds to disadvantaged communities that are on the front lines of climate change. So we are hopeful that this can provide a roadmap for the negotiations happening in the legislature over the next 2 months.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's really helpful. And Sneha, there's a question for you as well. If you want to come back on screen, what scale of investment would be required to decarbonize all of the existing homes in California? And you may not know that, but if you could shed some light on any budget projection as it relates to decarbonizing homes, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, according to a study by Building Decarbonization Coalition, decarbonizing all California homes is estimated to cost between 72 to 150 billion. So quite a lot more than what is allocated currently. And the federal funding, even if you include the federal funding with the 292 million that's allocated to California through the federal home energy rebates, that's only projected to reach about 1% of the 5 million low-income households. And so, I think that just goes to show how important the state EBD funds are, because even the total committed amount of 922 million is still, combined with the federal funding, will only reach a small percentage. So let's make sure to target those towards the communities who need it the most and the transition. And as I'd mentioned in my presentation, even the proposed cut is more than how much the federal funding would support the EBD program. So there's still going to be a cut if it's if the current proposal is adopted.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more quick question for the Assembly member, which is, what climate programs are you prioritizing to protect from cuts in the budget negotiations?
So definitely wildfire related mitigation efforts, renewable energy. I'm also very interested in the sustainable ag and utilization of natural lands and resiliency component. That's also very big in my district and something I've been pushing here in my, so far limited tenure, but something I'm very committed to as well. So I think we have to do kind of an all of the above strategy going forward.
Thank you so much. And Assembly member, I know you're very busy, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and share your thoughts, especially in light of your leadership in the subcommittee 4 as it relates to the climate budget issue. I also want to thank our other speakers, Bonnie Benawal, Sneha Ayagari, Chris Chavez, and Amy Costa, who had to leave us. Wanted to again ask Rob to put our call to action in the chat. Again, this is a call to action where you can just click on it and it'll take you to a page where you can send the message to the governor that fossil fuel subsidies and tax breaks need to be eliminated from this year's budget, and those funds need to be redirected to the climate investments that we've identified. Also, we're announcing our next webinar, which is going to go forward on Thursday, May 30th. And it's going to be centered around California's community choice agencies celebrating success. So it'll be more uplifting than perhaps this webinar was. But we're looking forward to having some wonderful speakers available for you that day. Thank you everyone for attending and for putting up with us when we had our technical issues at the very beginning, and really appreciate all your assistance and your attention, and thank you for being here. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.